Yeah, thanks. I'm Chris Jackson, and this is going to be a very odd talk for me. So it's a new talk, and the weirdness of this talk is reflected in the weirdness, but the reality of the title of my presentation, which is Abseiling into an Active Volcano is Easier Than Removing Systematic Racism from Academia. So we're going to cover a lot of ground here, and I wanted to touch on three things really. One is one way in which we can communicate science, and that's through, TV shows and abseiling into volcanoes. And that's sort of what the organisers of the conference originally asked me to talk about, but we thought in the discussions leading up to the conference that it'd be kind of remiss of us not to talk about a very topical issue at the moment, which is to do with equality, diversity and inclusion in science and academia and society in general, but also, the ability of Black people to engage in those things and in geosciences as well. So then there's going to be a pivot in this talk to discuss some of those things. And then look at the value of science communication, the value of representation, and then also to conclude with some of the barriers to that and what we can do about removing those. So yeah, I just wanted to start off with a video, and hopefully the sound will work, we'll see, about expedition behind science and all the messy racism stuff. Let's talk a little bit about geology, because I think it's still quite interesting really, in my part-time job. So why go to the Congo to look at volcanoes? Well, it's a place of continental extension. It's a place where the Earth's crust is being stretched. And when we get stretching of the Earth's crust, as we're seeing in this flyover of the Earth's surface in the East African Rift, we can see these black scarps in here, these long black lines. And these long black lines are giant fractures, which we call normal faults. And these are normal faults which allow the Earth's crust to extend. Now, in the top left of this image now, you'll see what looks like a hill or a mountain. And as we swing round to look towards the northwest, you can see that coming from this hill are these kind of lobate features in here. And these are actually lava flows. So what we're looking at here is a volcano in the East African Rift. And the reason we have volcanoes there is because the magma can ascend through those giant fractures, up those normal faults, and feed these large volcanic centers. And that's why we have volcanoes in East Africa. It's not a coincidence. So if you're into volcanoes, book yourself a ticket to Kigali in Rwanda. It's a great place to start. When you get down onto the ground in Rwanda and into the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we went in the show was a place called Goma, a city there of about 1.1 million people on the north shore of this big lake called Lake Kivu. And Lake Kivu is this lake which sits within one of these normal fault-bound rift valleys. From the air, it's Volcano City, we call it. There's 8 giant volcanoes. There's these volcanoes here, which actually lie within Rwandan territory. And then there's these volcanoes which we visited in the show near Nyamulogira and Nyiragongo, which sit just north of the city of Goma. And these are perfect sort of triangular-shaped volcanoes forming part of this much larger volcanic province, which is called the Virunga Volcanic Province, which covers around about 60,000 square kilometers. These are kind of like the 8 poster childs of the volcanic province, but there are over 1,000 volcanoes and volcanic vents, both on land and underwater in Lake Kivu. So this is a very, very magmatically active area. These graphics are fine, but what about like the reality for the people who live in Goma? And one thing I thought the show did really well in terms of the science communication was highlighting the science, but also the people who live with, in this case, a very real and present geohazard. So this is Goma, 1.1 million people. Population went up from a few 100,000 during the Rwandan genocide. So this was a place which was already economically challenged before there was a giant influx of people. So you have all of that chaos that's obvious in this photo here, which I took from a UN helicopter. And just behind this chaos and this really difficult living situation is this giant volcano. And everywhere you go in Goma, Nyiragongo kind of looms over it and it sits in the shadow. So you can see some of the tensions around, kind of filming in a location like this, but then also the importance of trying to communicate the day-to-day living experiences of the people. And as you saw in the video I showed at the start of the trailer, the woman says the volcano has 2 faces. It can kind of give life and it can take it away. So we decided to ascend this volcano to look into it and show the importance in a real way of scientific observations of volcanic locations, because it's not just for glory, it's not just for glamour, it has a material impact and benefit for the people living not just around this volcano, but around other ones. But it's hard. As you can see from this cross-section, the volcano sits at about 3.5 kilometers. We started from about 2.5 or just below, and Goma sits at about 1.5 kilometers. So there's kind of a 2-kilometer vertical ascent to get to the top of the volcano to do any science. And it's physically really demanding. This is the limit of my PowerPoint skills. You know, we did this, we went past this cone called Shihiru, up to the crater edge, and then we did this as well. So this is my black belt in PowerPoint being shown here. So we descended down towards the lava lake, which sits right at the bottom of the crater in Nyiragongo. What does it take to do that? It's not straightforward. We took 4 tons of equipment up. So you can see some of it on the left of this photo here. Tents, water, climbing equipment. What did it take to get 4 tons of equipment up the mountain? It took 142 porters taken from the local Porter Association. There's all that physicality and all that logistical lifting which is going on to make a bit of science happen. But then on top of that, when you put the com of the SciComm bit on top, that's represented here. Just at the bottom of my photo, you can see here, this is Will Edwards, and he was one of the camera operators. So you're trying to do something which is physically and logistically challenging and mentally very demanding, all whilst trying to make a TV show as well. And you can imagine the tensions that then can arise from that conflict between wanting to do science, trying to do it in a very difficult position, but then also trying to make a TV show, which then distills out of all that chaos something which you can communicate and mean something to an audience. As we got to the top of the volcano, it went from about 28 degrees, where that last photograph was taken, to about 5 degrees, 4 degrees. You can see here the temperature dropped through the floor. What I love about this photo is this kind of Simon Winchcombe is in the background, one of the directors in his fancy Arc'teryx 300, 400, 500 pound jacket. And then there were all the porters here in their dinner jackets and these very thin shirts, wearing welly boots, carrying 30,000 pound pieces of camera equipment. The physical adaptation and the mental and physical fortitude of the people who live in this environment is truly remarkable, how they deal with these incredibly steep slopes, these very variable temperatures. And you know, it was kind of, you know, by the time we got up to the top of the volcano, most of them had already got back down. That's how they were adapted to it. But you can see at the top of the volcano here, just at the top of the photo, here's the hut. So this was about a 6-hour walk to get up there. All the way during this walk we were going up, we were filming. So this thing took a long time to ascend. I just now want to show you a sequence of videos which kind of go through the abseiling, and I'll kind of jump in at the end of each of them, which kind of shows you a bit about how we got down into the volcano. And I'm going to link that into some stuff I'm going to show later in the talk. So this is a view down into the crater. This is the world's largest lava lake. It's about 260 meters in diameter. It's about 30 meters deep at present, the main lava lake chamber. This is an internal terrace in the volcano. You can see there's this beautiful little vent with lava flows, which was erupting about 2 weeks before we got there, just here, which was why we abandoned the abseil down to T3, terrace 3. This is terrace 2. These beautiful fractures which are allowing the volcano to collapse in on itself. We call that Caldera Collapse. And this is the 300-meter high wall that we had to abseil down in the next sequence. So you can see you have this vast crater which was over 1 kilometer in diameter, this 300-meter deep hole which you have to get down to, and a volcanic province which was very, very active at the time. So there's lots of challenges to kind of working in that environment. So what was it like to get down into the crater? So you can see there, Aldo is probably one of the scariest and least encouraging human beings in the world, but he also knows how to abseil, so I did feel very safe in his presence. That was the kind of, you know, and what was really great about the filming of that sequence is a lot of the fear and a lot of the dialogue was caught very naturally. There was no script for anything we did in the show. And I think in terms of science communication, that's a really important point, is to make kind of unvarnished views of what's really going on, not just when you're doing something as extreme as this to go and do a bit of science, but anytime you're talking about science, is to communicate, like I think Cara said at the start, you know, the messiness, Cara said at the start, like the messiness that goes on behind it. And that's one thing you can capture even in an extreme piece of science communication like this. So you can see the tents in this image here, you can see us on the lip on here, and you're going to see the abseil sequence now as we went down. So you can see all very dramatic, and like I say, Aldo cementing his reputation has not been particularly encouraging by seeing death and destruction at every footstep on the abseil. But the abseil is amazing, right? 4 hours or 4.5 hours to do the abseil. It got edited to about 1.5 minutes, and that's because there wasn't just me and Aldo on the ropes. There was me and Aldo, but also one of the camera operators. So there's this very intricate dance of trying to get different angles on the shots as we were going down. So at times I was holding the camera so that the camera operator could sort of go round the belay points, of which there was over 20 belay points on the way down this huge abseil. So, you know, lots and lots of moving parts in terms of the safety, and also trying to capture aspects of the science. We did actually do a sequence where we talked a bit about some of the layers, as you can see in this image here, what we call the volcanoclastic stratigraphy, so the lava flows and the effusive volcanic, all the effusive volcanic products in here. But it was just too involved and too stressful to actually do the science communication bit while we were doing the abseil. So we kind of bailed on that and then just focused on keeping ourselves alive. It was an amazing experience. You know, I've given the people in Leicester, you know, who saw this before, you know, it's an amazing experience to go there, and I've given lots of talks about the geology of that and more about the filming. But I just thought I'd give you that kind of intro, or that kind of half of the talk, a bit about just that bit of the science communication. So I'm happy to tell you any questions about that. But then, you know, it rather raises this question, you know, the random Twitter troll says, well, who gives a shit, really, if some random black guy, you know, goes on telling abseils into a volcano? And I'm going to come back to that in light of some of the experiences I've had in the last week. And the argument I'm going to make is, you know, there are many reasons. Some are very obvious, and some are very big, and some are very small. And one of the most obvious reasons is because of the impacts those sorts of things can have. And again, it doesn't need to be abseiling to a volcano. It can be just a school's visit. It could be anything where you just sit around and educate people as to the importance of science. And we're seeing that very much with COVID at the moment, making people receptive to the science and believe the science and believe the motivations behind scientists and the purpose of what they're doing is, you know, that's all part of the conversation of science, not just the practicalities of how we do it. And this impact can occur at different levels, and I'm going to go through those now. So there can be local level, and this is actually my house in London here, in Acton in West London. It can be in your own house, you can impact people. It can be regional, so around London, in my case, national, around the UK, or global as well. I'm going to kind of give you examples of how my experience with Expedition Volcano allowed me to make an impact at those 4 different levels. And this is not, don't worry about this being about me and my impact in that show. It's just to highlight how the impact can be multi-level, and if you have appropriate exposure, as a TV show does give you, or something like the RI Christmas lectures does give you, we need to harness these opportunities to reach out in many different ways to many different people. So locally, this was off Twitter. You know, this was from my daughter, my middle daughter, Hazel, who at the time was 4, but she suddenly became fascinated by volcanoes and started drawing them all the time, and they watched the show with me, and you know, they made me read a couple of books about volcanoes, and then we did a little volcano experiment and things, and I talked a bit about degassing and things, and that was with a 4-year-old. And before that, I guess I'd never taken the time to do that, but you know, you can have that local impact in your own home. You know, there's people who regionally, kind of around the country then were kind of engaged in the show, and this was a tweet that came in from this child who had built this little volcano themselves and made these little people. And I love this because if you look closely, she'd cut out our heads and stuck them on these people. There's me, Aldo, Zand, and Kayla, and even the goat who went in the Mizuku that kind of passed out. And she made this little model of that. And then the daddy DM'd me and was talking about how excited she was about the fact there was a range of scientists on there. So they weren't just volcano scientists, there was sand on there and Aldo, and you know, there was a lot of representation for different people in there. I went to a local school, North Ealing, and did an outreach event, and I got these like lovely letters and drawings back from them, and you know, the students talking passionately about how they were interested in science more generally now. And this was a school which has a very mixed demographic. It had 65% of students in this school have English as an additional language, EAL it's called. So a lot of first and second generation sort of immigrant children there. So it was a very important thing to go in and speak to them about, and for me to represent as a working class black person, you know, the benefits of science. More widely, went and spoke to some professional society, or not professional societies, but amateur science societies in Sussex, and you know, went and talked to lots of different groups about this. It's really great because they give you wine and chocolates and things, so it's worth doing just for the payoff. I went up to Manchester, talked to a school called St. Bede's. You know, I'm wearing a t-shirt there, which is a Black in Academia t-shirt, and Black in Academia is one of these advocacy groups who provide support and mentorship to try and draw in and sustain black students and black staff in academia. So I highly recommend, I'm going to put links in all of these notes that you'd be able to click on, but yeah, and like with Black in Geoscience, the t-shirt I'm wearing now as well, these are all groups who are pushing for that representation. So let's think about more global as well, stepping up to the next level. This was a hugely inspiring email I received from a teacher who was actually in Chicago. And I'm not going to read it all out, but the show was shown in the US, and she just says a few key words is, I don't know if you know what a massive impact seeing you being an expert who isn't African, but being in Africa had on the students in my class. It never occurred to many of my students that there were people who looked like them living in other countries, so now they're interested in geography. I show a lot of scientific documentaries, and this is the first time the experts weren't all white. Watching got my kids thinking about becoming scientists. So, you know, there's this kind of really material feedback you get and some impact that you hope has some long-lasting effect. And even if one kid out of that class goes on to a STEM discipline because they in some way saw this share, not me, but just saw something STEM-y, that's exactly why we need to do this. And this is the final story in terms of the national impact. I love this one because I got this letter from a girl who, from her mum, who said she watched the show, and she sent me these photos of her with this volcano she'd drawn, and this kind of letter saying how she'd really liked the show, and it was really exciting, and asking me if I could write back. And then there was all these beautiful kind of Lego type things she'd built. Of the volcano you can see in here, and then there's a hut that we were staying in, and you can see there's some gorillas lurking around in here. And then if you zoom in, there's this little black geoscientist she made here with a hand lens and a laptop, and this geode around, and that's me. And so there's this beautiful letter sort of talking about how her daughter liked TVs because her dad liked Nova, which was the show it was on, but how she liked me, and my nickname in the show was Jacket Man, because I had a red jacket. So I took some time, I went and bought her a card, and I wrote back to Helena and said, thank you for your message, and you know, my favourite rock is a piece of lava, and you know, so I actually took a bit of time to write back to her, and then she got the rock. I didn't know if it would arrive, but I sent her back a piece of vesicle-rich basaltic rock from Nyiragonga that I picked up on the walk up the volcano, and gave it to her, and that's her in receipt of that. So there's, you know, just in that brief diversion there, hopefully I've shown you that, you know, there's much bigger impact in terms of translate, you know, geosciences at the moment trying to think about its position in terms of, let's say, the Sustainable Development Goals, so global betterment and global sustainability, how we translate our science into policy. But then, you know, all the way down from that very high level thing, there are these, I would consider them more personal interactions you can have and more personal influences. And I still think these are valuable, because I think if we can communicate with these very diverse bodies of younger people and school students, then we can kind of start to infuse and engage them at that point as well. And then there's a bunch of other socioeconomic things we need to deal with as well between there and maybe ultimately university admissions, but that doesn't give us a free pass on not engaging at this level as well. So that's all brilliant, right? That's all ace. And, you know, I'm trying to make a case for representation and, you know, with the Royal Institution Christmas lectures being announced, you'd have thought that was a great thing, but obviously it's not, because as you can see here, you know, after the Sky interview went out last week and I talked a bit about, I think Cara, who introduced this, said, I made a comment about, you know, science isn't just about the practicalities, it's about who's doing it, because ultimately science, who it's being done by and who it's being done for, and the questions that are being asked are dictated by those people who have their hands on the wheel. So in some ways, science isn't divorced from the scientists who do it. So, you know, you get comments back like this, so what, if you never publish this, publicise this, the majority of people wouldn't have batted an eyelid, you're fueling the fire with this kind of reporting. So somebody there saying, well, if you frame something around something being black, you're just encouraging racism because you're celebrating a black person. He may be qualified, but if anybody believes whoever makes this decision didn't willfully go out of their way to make a black professor in these times of wokeness and virtual signalling, you're kidding yourself. This is as racist as picking a white person simply because they're white. You know, I have a decent amount of imposter syndrome in a way, but I kind of think I can talk about rocks for a little while. But I think it's kind of like hurtful to kind of suggest that somebody's only being picked because they're black and they have no qualification whatsoever. I'm going to put it to you that I have more qualification than Catty F, who tweeted that. You get more subtle things like science isn't racist, which is kind of, people are there as splitting hairs. They're trying to say the scientific thing, you know, how chemistry works and how physics works, that isn't racist. But I would argue, again, because science and scientists are not separate things, you know, science can become racially biased by the scientists who are doing it. And I think a lot of these sorts of comments are really sniping around the fringes at a much bigger issue. And then my favourite one at the bottom from DV was, does he look like a scientist without his glasses? And just, I thought I'd leave that one in, and you can decide in the Q&A whether you think I do. Ben Britton, my friend, said no in response to that tweet, by the way. So why do we need diversity? You know, I've made a case for it at a local level, but I think we need it, you know, when we think about it in terms of geosciences, we need it for much bigger goals. And I already touched on this in terms of, let's say, the Sustainable Development Goals and things which are encapsulated in there, like the big environmental and economic challenges we've got going forward. If we want to be sustainable and we want to target our science towards those communities globally, we need to know what those global problems are. Solutions, quote unquote, we come up with to implement those into local policy and to influence people locally in other parts of the world. We need to have a good understanding of their culture. So it's important that we have those people engaged in the discussion and we don't parachute in with maybe what could be inappropriate solutions. So I encourage you to look at the geoscience for the future sort of thing. You know, and people have started to look at diversity in geosciences. There's a number of papers here, and I've got links in here. And geoscience is crucial to the future, but it's very much stuck in the past in terms of equity and inclusion. My next few slides will highlight that. There's a lack of racial diversity as a result of both systemic racism and also some things which are unique, we believe, to geosciences. And a lot of what's been done has been based in the US. So, you know, these basically all of these papers on the top left in here are US focused. What about the UK? I want to take a bit of time to talk about some of the statistics around BAME and black inclusion in geosciences. So if you look at BAME 18 to 24-year-olds, there's some qualifiers down here, black, Asian, mixed and others in the UK census, and the statistics I'm showing here are from the HESA data. It's about 18.5%. If we look at BAME students in undergraduate education, it's slightly higher at 25% or so. If we look at BAME students in undergraduate physical sciences, which includes the subjects in here, of which geology is one of them, you can see there's a drop there. So there's 16.8. So it's less than the kind of UK BAME population, but it's also less than the BAME populations against the total undergraduate population. So there's a decrease there. And even more depressingly, if we look at BAME students, and we're looking at BAME at the moment, not the B, we're not looking at black, we're looking at BAME overall, In undergraduate geology, we get down to 10.1% in here. So you can see that slow descent in representation in BAME students as you go from just generally undergraduate education down to geology specifically. One is if we look at postgraduate research, and I should say all of this material is coming from a paper which has been written by Natasha Dowie and a bunch of other people, which I'll include the link for. If we look at BAME students in postgraduate research, so this is relevant to you in the CENTA cohort in here, it's about 18.1%, and I'd be interested to know what the CENTA statistics are around postgraduate research. If we look at physical sciences again, you can see that drop to 12.1%. So physical sciences are those disciplines we saw on the previous slide. And if we look at it in geology, we get down to 10.4%. So again, this kind of steady overall decrease in the postgraduate research. This isn't masters, this is PhD primarily. If we then look at another thing, I love this. I didn't make it, but it was on the internet. Because the league tables came out, I think, today, so I thought this was very appropriate. If you look at access for BAME students into so-called high-tariff universities, so Oxbridge, Imperial, Russell Group, bearing in mind high tariff is principally dictated by these nonsensical league tables, BAME participation in those institutions is around about 4%, but if you look at, let's say, low tariff universities, to use the term, it's much higher, which probably says something about where BAME students feel, says a number of things, probably says where BAME students feel comfortable to go to, but it probably also says something about the admissions procedures and the way that these high tariff universities are set up, which are meaning that BAME students are choosing to go elsewhere. And that's an important thing which has been discussed at length in the media. If we look at the way scholarships are awarded to people, this is UKRI, so studentships awarded to ethnic minorities. There's a change in terms here, because ethnic minorities is the term that's used by UKRI. You can see in here that we have about 9% has gone to BAME students, and that 6% has gone, to ethnic minority students, and for NERC it's 6% versus the BAME population in the UK for 18 to 34, which would be the age group that would be sort of in the range eligible for award or likely to be awarded one of these scholarships, which is around 20%. So there's an undershoot there, and there's, I'm just presenting some numbers here, and we can have a discussion about why these numbers are like they are, but it's just important to get these data out. So why is there this attrition? We think it's for two reasons. One is general. There could be cultural expectations about, your parents might, we've historically worked in this area, so you can go to university, but then when you come out of there, you need to go and work in this family business, or we don't value geoscience as much as we do some other kind of professional trade. Location of study could be off-putting for people financially. There's awarding gaps. Some of you may have heard of the attainment gap, that BAME students are less likely to get, they're less likely to get awarded first and 2-1s than white students. Social behaviours, alcohol-fueled cultures in earth science departments. There's lots of bias swirling around. The application systems could be biased as well, and I'll come back to that. There's lower completion rates for BAME students, and that often arises because BAME students are from lower socioeconomic groups, therefore they're having to work during their studies, which means that they're less able to focus on their studies, which then can lead to them dropping out. And there's a lack of representation at faculty level, and that contributes to what we would call a hostile environment, because if you can't have that representation I've talked about in the middle part of the talk, you may not feel welcome. Geosciences specifically, some spooky stuff there. Rural environments, about 6% of people in the GeoSoc questionnaire said one reason, going back, one reason they got into geosciences was because of, being outside and sort of their engagement with the kind of countryside, and a lot of BAME and black students grow up not in rural environments, right? They grow up in urban settings, in lower income households. Geoscience is very white and very male, and like career perceptions at the moment are very are challenged, or we need to highlight more what the career options are. Fieldwork can be a barrier around for these reasons here: cultural sensitivities, costs, inclusivity, and racial harassment. Again, the alcohol culture and the lack of recognition of colonial links. Earth Sciences has other colonial links, as I've discovered with dealing with some of the Delabesh issues at Imperial College, and that's quite unique to geosciences, and it's one of the things why we might have this attrition. Just to go back to this point of representation, again, to try and link across a few themes in my talk, this idea of representation at faculty level. Now, it's a busy slide in here, but you can see that the Bain professors in the UK is about 11%. If you look at black professors in the UK, it's about 0.7%. And that's coming from this relatively recent piece in the Guardian. Just to put those in numbers, universities employed about 220,000 academic staff, about 2% are black, and only 140 of 21,000 professors, sorry, are black. And in 2018, there were about 25 black British women professors, and I think there's 145 black male professors or men across all of the British universities, and I'm one of them. And there's 2 black geosciences male professors. So what can be done? Let's try and go into a bit of a positive ending sort of for the talk. We can try and broaden participation by teaching sustainably, adapting fieldwork, providing paid summer schools and internships. You know, there's a number of things we can do there. I won't read them all. Remove structural inequalities. You know, think about faculty diversity, tackle things which are exclusionary to black people going into those spaces in terms of what is in the curriculum and what's physically in our spaces, as demonstrated, for example, recently by the Delabesh issue at Imperial College. We want funders to be more transparent in how they're recruiting, and there's been some talk on Twitter yesterday around some aspects of that, and the application process is more transparent. What's being measured and why? And we need to do that. You know, this is a kind of classic kind of image of various forms of looking at equality versus equity in the short and long term. You know, what we could do to allow everybody access is to kind of implement some of the things on the previous slide, which will bring up and raise up those other people. And the important thing about this graphic, which is one thing that often gets lost in this race and racism discussion, is the people here on the left, who are essentially the white people in this narrative, are not having their stones removed, particularly, right? The women are being raised up, the black people are being raised up, and these people still have a fair crack at the whip. And I think that's one thing that really winds me up, is people think that there's a kind of a zero-sum game going on, and it's not that. And in fact, to be better, as you can see on the right, is to remove all the barriers, right? Remove those structural inequalities that mean that, you know, let's say a white working class man, because that's a topical conversation at the moment, they have as much access and they're uninhibited in their progress as well. It's not to make their lives more difficult at the expense of white women or black people on the right hand side here. So how can we do this? We can do reports. This is the report from Oxford. We can write letters. This is a letter led by Sam Giles to UKRI. We can try and back things like BB STEM, Black British Professionals in STEM, and we can try and, you know, spend our time and our free labour as some of the people in that minority group to make it better. And that's kind of hard and can be kind of frustrating. We can do things at a very high level. This is from Ben Britton's Freedom of Information Act request to CENTA itself, and it went to the University of Birmingham. And, you know, Ben made a number of questions around what I just talked about. Can we please see the policies, procedures and scoring forms are to be recruited, shortlisted and awarded, information about the supervisors, because part of this is the bias that they may carry, recognised or unrecognised biases. This is not to say anybody at CENTA or anywhere else is biased, it's just that we should be actively monitoring that and being self-reflective enough. You know, who's the panels, who's involved, and what demographic information is being collected. And that demographic information is really important, as you saw earlier on, because we need to frame the problem and get a sense of the scale, more cynically, some people won't react until there's a graph put in front of them. Some people will say, there's no problem. We've got, this person said something's wrong, but that's qualitative data. It's only experiential. We need a pie chart, right? So, okay, well, let's get the data together and let's start within the bounds of GDPR and everything else and confidentiality. Let's collect some data and actually start to shine a light on these issues from which we can then make bespoke solutions, because BAME is a bucket term, and the challenges and the potential solutions for the different component parts of BAME will differ. So we need to disaggregate that term to make more appropriate solutions. So that's why that demographic information is important. However, in response to this, there was a couple of refusal notices, and this is all public domain data that came back. So there was a refusal to provide some personal information which would allow the demographic information to be collected. And it's based on the problem of small numbers, essentially, is that if you start reporting numbers less than 5, which tells you something anyway, that they're very small numbers, you can't then say, all you know is that it's less than 5. You don't know if it's 0, you don't know if it's 5. But actually, if you look at some of the demographic data that came back from this, and is coming back from some of Ben's other FOI requests, those numbers are small. So we're trying to compile some of those data. The scary thing is people are doing this, academics are doing this on their own time. The other thing which is, again, I raise is the other refusal notice is the problem of competing interests. So there's commercial interests at play here, isn't there, for institutions, in terms of they have a strong desire to address and tackle these inequalities, but equally they have a strong desire, as articulated in the Freedom of Information Act refusal notice number 4, information about the application process, and this was in response to the request for the scoring sheet, is commercially sensitive because it's a key asset in developing and implementing the university's marketing recruitment strategies. These effectively affect the university's ability to recruit students on whose fees and achievements the university's financial and reputational success depends. And again, this is not to solely criticise Birmingham, because I'm sure this is coming back in from the other FOIs, but it's merely to point out that one of the barriers to progress in a lot of this discussion we're having may arise because, despite the best intentions of some of these institutions, there are commercial issues at play which may kind of hamper, because the reason we want the score sheet is to say that the score sheet is problematic. And to be fair to some people on the call here, I do know that the score sheet is being actively looked at to improve the questions to make sure that they're less discriminatory in a way suggested by Sam Giles's letter to UKRI. But I just think it's an important point to raise that there are these challenges out here and we need to try and get our hands around them. So just to finish, I've hopefully showed you the value of science communication and the fun bit of science communication and how that has the potential to impact people at multiple scales. Why it's important to have science communication and why it's important to have that impact on people is because geosciences faces these major challenges in the future, and it has a role to play in just general equity in society. It's a conversation we should be having anyway as just decent human beings, even if we didn't really care about geosciences. There are barriers to that, and they go all the way from random people on Twitter saying that, this is some of the milder abuse I got, all the way from that through to kind of, institutions like the refusal notice 4, which again, it exists. You can read it however you want, but there are things which we're going to have to fight against and try and work with to make a change. But let's be positive, I think we're starting to put together all of these ways in which we can try and tackle some of these problems. And it's just a case of us as scientists and as academics and the people who run the funding agencies in our institutions to get on board with this in the same way. So thank you very much for your time. Sorry I ran over, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.